Good morning, everyone. I know people are still getting their coffee, and please feel free to do so. But I thought we should get started since we have a bit to cover today. And as you notice, we have a graphic in our handout, which is nice. It's also on a billboard outside of town. I can't remember. I think I saw it on 30 for a while. Maybe it was on that one that's digital that switches over, but it's a very famous image. So we'll be talking about that, but I want to set the context for it first. We looked at John Calvin last time, his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, it's a harmony of the Gospels that he wrote. It was finally published in 1555. We're looking at another movement that starts in the Swiss territories before that, about 30 years before that, in the town of Zurich, under the leadership initially of Ulrich Zwingli, who is the other great Reformed theologian. In fact, if you go through New Berlin, I think it is, in west of town, there's the Zwingli United Church of Christ there. I sent a picture of that to my friends during the Reformation anniversary, and it was Martin Luther, Martin Luther, Martin Luther, and so I posted it and said, if you're tired of Luther, try Zwingli. So Zwingli started the movement that actually became known as the Reformed tradition, and Calvin joined on to that movement later. In 1525, though, there were followers of Zwingli who became very dissatisfied with the direction his reform movement was taking. He claimed that it was all according to scripture, but they had a disputation. You can imagine this. They had a disputation in Zurich with a representative of the bishop on one hand and Zwingli on the other, and the city council as the judges of the debate. And Zwingli debated against images in the church and against the mass as a sacrifice and all of these things. And the city council said, yes, you're right. All of these things contradict the word of God, and we'll let you know when any changes can be made. And Zwingli's followers were like, wait, the word of God says this, and they agree that the word of God says that, and yet you're going to let the city council determine the direction of the reform? And Zwingli's like, well, of course I am. The church has always worked together with temporal authority, which it had, actually, going all the way back to Constantine, right? So the church and the state were virtually melded together from that period on. Theodosius, at the end of the 300s, issues an edict promulgating the doctrine of the Trinity and saying that there's only one church, that the Catholic Church, and anyone else, including Jewish synagogues, for instance, are not authorized churches. And that if you deny things like the doctrine of the Trinity, or if you're baptized again, you'll be executed, right? And so there's a very famous book by one of my former professors, Jaroslav Pelikan, called Creeds. And in it, he laments the loss of faith in the doctrine of the Trinity and how other opinions start to be promulgated in the 19th century. And he says, well, it probably didn't help that you didn't die anymore if you denied the Trinity. That probably didn't. So this is the beginning in the 16th century of a movement that tries to separate. I mean, in America, this should be very familiar, but you can see where a lot of this came from. Try to separate the church from state involvement, right? Because that'll just constantly compromise your following of the word of God. And so they began looking at all of the different ways that this enmeshment of the church with civil authority, and this was just a city council. You can imagine if you're dealing with imperial authority, all the different ways that the church was compromising itself by its involvement with the state. And the first thing they looked at was baptism. And as they read the Bible, they saw that throughout the New Testament, that the rhythm is hear the gospel, repent, decide to obey, be baptized, right? And so there's this rhythm throughout. And so why are we baptizing infants? They can't hear the gospel. They have nothing for which to repent. They haven't resolved to lead a new life. And therefore they shouldn't, the first step of their obedience is not there. And so their baptism is illegitimate. And so they get called Anabaptists for denying this, because Ana means again. And that also is a stain then, because according to imperial law and then the local laws as well, anyone who's rebaptized should be executed or could be executed. They were executed. So to call them Anabaptists is actually a misnomer because they didn't think infant baptism was baptism, right? And so, we have a way of doing this in the Episcopal Church, which is when the infant is supposed to answer, do you renounce Satan, and other people answer, and then let us reaffirm our own baptismal covenant in the words of the Apostles' Creed. That's what the baptized is supposed to say, right? But the fact that we all chime in kind of covers up that there's no answer coming from the infant because there couldn't possibly be an answer coming from the infant. So they have an interesting point, and it ruins every baptism you go to from this point on. But so they would just say that's a baby's bath, right? You're just washing a baby. That's not a baptism. Rather harsh criticism, but then they also started looking at the New Testament itself, especially the Sermon on the Mount. And they noticed that Jesus says, don't swear at all. Don't swear any oaths at all. And the state today, let alone then, requires you to swear oaths. Otherwise, you're viewed as bearing false testimony. Jesus says, do not resist evil. There are Christians who are fighting in wars, right? Who are being hangmen and jailers and people like that. And so they thought, this whole amendment with the state has led the church completely to disobey the teachings of Jesus. And so the only way you can obey the teachings of Jesus is to be baptized as an adult upon your own confession of faith and your own resolve to obey, and to obey the teachings of Jesus as they're found in places like the Sermon on the Mount, and also to emulate his life. But he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a juror. In fact, when people come and ask him to adjudicate a dispute, he said, I'm not a judge of you and your brothers. Who made me judge? So they have a really interesting point, right? So in any case, the movement takes off from 1525 is the first rebaptism. And then in 1527, the city of Zurich passes an ordinance against baptism, adult baptism, believers, Anabaptism, if you will. And the first of the supporters of this move, Felix Mons, is taken out into the Lamont River, has his arms tied around him in front of his wife, and he's drowned. They drop him in the river, right? And this was, in fact, meant to be very funny. They called it the third baptism, right? And it was the favorite mode of execution for women in this movement. So the Felix was one of the first to be drowned. He was the first martyr, and he was drowned. But from that point on, men will be tortured with hot iron implements and then burned or beheaded. But the women will usually be drowned. So that becomes the pattern. So the movement immediately is on the run, as you can imagine, and hiding in the forests and woods, etc., because no church would accept them into their buildings. The movement is later led, very shortly led, by Michael Sattler. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a Benedictine monk who joined this movement. He got married and was a major leader, and he helps formulate one of the most important confessions of this movement, the Schleitheim Confession, in 1527. You can see how quickly things are developing. And he was apprehended and tried by a civil court and sentenced to death. And of course, they're tormenting him as he's awaiting his execution. And they say things like, the sword will argue with you and things like that. So you can imagine how much fun that was. But the tale of his execution is very interesting because it tells you a lot about the practice of the Anabaptists. And this is right after the movement got started. So he was sentenced to be given into the hands of the hangman, who shall lead him to the square and cut off his tongue, then chain him to a wagon, there tear his body twice with red-hot tongs, and again when he is brought before the gate 5 more times. So tear his flesh 7 times with red-hot tongs. When this is done, he is to be burned to powder as a heretic. And wherefore, on May 20th, he was led to the marketplace, and the judgment which had been pronounced was executed against him. After cutting off his tongue, he was chained to the cart, and according to the verdict, torn with red-hot tongs, then burned in fire. Nevertheless, at first in the square, and again at the place of execution, he prayed to God for his persecutors, right, who were tormenting him, right? And also encouraged others to pray for them, the people watching this. And finally spoke thus, Almighty God, thou art the way, the truth, And since I have been taught, or I have not been taught otherwise by anyone, so by thy help I will testify this day to the truth and seal it with my blood. When he commended his spirit to God, he was thrown onto the flame of on the frame into the fire, and then he died. After long suffering, he died. So that's kind of a typical execution that follows. And then, of course, other followers who watched that, other people who were within his community watched that. Some of them recanted, right? Who wouldn't, right? Like, okay, I'm not going to do that. Then others didn't, and they were beheaded, and then their wives were drowned. So it was quite a scene. And there were people who actually recanted, as you can imagine. So the Schleitheim Confession is an important document because it helps keep together a group that is, you can imagine the force that would disperse this group is really great. And there's a lot of dissension and difference within it. But Sattler's work and those who were with him on the Schleitheim Confession was really quite remarkable. It's still in use today. John Calvin thought it was actually, he refuted it. He wrote a book refuting it, but on the other hand, he had a lot of respect for it. He thought it really had a lot to offer. Look, this is in Germany and Switzerland. Yeah, German. The Schleitheim Confession this is in Swiss territories initially. The worst place for these followers was Austria. They just got completely smoked out of there. And they wind up actually moving toward the Netherlands eventually. And so you probably know the Mennonites and Menno Simons. He's later, 1536 to 1561. He actually died in bed, which I'm sure he didn't expect to do. But the Swiss Brethren, as they were called, this was the group, the Schleitheim Confession and the people in Zurich. The Swiss Brethren eventually join up with Menno and his group, and they become called the Mennonites. And to this day, actually. And Menno actually has a very interesting description of the life of believers. I had it copied on my phone. I'll pull it up here. It's called On the Cross of the Saints. It's a book describing the Christian life. And it gives you an idea of their understanding of what they were doing. He initially talks about the people killing the people who were called Anabaptists, and then about the Anabaptists. He said, "Worthy and faithful brethren in the Lord, note well, such a blind, naked, poor, miserable, and senseless people it is in divine things, who so bitterly persecute and destroy you without mercy on account of your faith. Therefore, the true and chosen children of God must not, no matter how heavily the cross may be laid on them by these people, be angry over them." You must not be angry over them, but sincerely pity them and sigh sorely for their poor souls with all meekness and fervor after the example of Christ and Stephen, praying over their raging and cursed folly and blindness, for they know not what they do. Who knows whether God may not give them eyes and hearts to see and know their blindness and unbelief, and to see what an impure life they have led, what kind of people they have persecuted, and whom they have pierced. And so the example of Jesus forgiving those crucifying him and the example of Stephen forgiving those stoning him to death becomes a major element. So it isn't just the teaching of Jesus, it's the way he died, it's the way Stephen died. So it's a really remarkable movement that way. And as I mentioned, the Swiss Brethren joined the Mennonites, and their basic base of operation is North Germany, but especially Holland, the Low Country, as they call it. In the 17th century, which we'll be backing up into the 16th century again, but in the 17th century, the Mennonites formulate the Dordrecht Confession in 1632. Dordrecht is one of the towns in Holland. And they include, it's really interesting, I was looking at the Anglican 39 Articles, which is our confession of faith formulated in the Reformation. And we have things like Christians can swear oaths and Christians can serve in the military. But this is what the Dordrecht Confession has in Article 14. It's called of revenge. As regards revenge, that is, to oppose an enemy with the sword, we believe and confess that the Lord Christ has forbidden and set aside to his disciples and followers all revenge and retaliation, and commanded them to render to no one evil for evil or cursing for cursing, but to put the sword in the sheath or as the prophets have predicted, to beat the swords into plowshares. We are to seek, we remember that Jesus did not inflict pain, sorrow, or harm on anyone. And like him, we must seek the highest welfare and salvation of all people, and even flee if we're being persecuted. So they could flee, and they did actually when they could. But we'll see that in our story for today. And suffer the spoiling of all our goods, that we must not harm anyone. And when we are smitten, rather turn the other cheek also than take revenge or retaliate. And moreover, that we must pray for our enemies, feed and refresh them wherever they are, whenever they are hungry or thirsty, and thus convince them by well-doing and overcome all ignorance. So this is in their confession of faith. This isn't something, that just, where is that in our confession of faith, right? Or in our prayers of the people? I mean, I'm serious. There's only one group of people Jesus commands us to pray for, and that's our enemies, right? So the Anabaptists have a point, And so we can ask ourselves why our Book of Common Prayer doesn't include that. And it comes out of a state church, so you can draw your own conclusions, right? Anyway, in the 1600s also, and this is where our illustration comes from, a Dutch Mennonite named Tieleman van Braght wrote a book called The Martyr's Mirror, which was also called The Bloody Theater. So its initial title was The Bloody Theater or The Martyr's Mirror. And I think they were right. They went with The Martyr's Mirror instead of The Bloody Theater. And it gives a very graphic account, especially in the second part, of more than 4,000 Christians who endured persecution, torture, and death for the sake of their faith. And obviously, most of them were what we would call Anabaptists. And it includes more than 50 finely detailed etchings by noted Dutch artist Van Luyken. That's on your sheet. And songs, letters, prayers, and confessions appear with the stories of many Christians who were able to love their enemies. This is a major theme in the book. Love their enemies and return good for evil, even as they were being tortured and killed. So they're praying for their torturers and persecutors as they're being killed. Yeah.
Persecutors, was it the Roman Church or was it all?
It's everybody join in. It's the Murder on the Orient Express, right? This is the one thing that Roman Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed could all agree upon. If you meet an Anabaptist, kill him or her. No, see, I'm serious. So when my wife and I were in London, there's a plaque behind St. Paul's, which is where the Anabaptists in England were tried. There were in 1535, I think it was, 25 Dutch flee from Holland because of the persecution at that time there and come to London. They're arrested, tried in St. Paul's Cathedral, and executed in Smithfield. And I said, I look and did a search saying, were any Anabaptists executed in St. Paul's? Go, oh, no. All the heretics were executed in Smithfield. So anyway, everyone knew that's where you would go to be executed. So yeah, the Anglicans executed Anabaptists, many. I mean, not just a few. The Roman Catholics executed them, especially in Austria. It was awful. The Reformed executed them wherever they would be found, and the Lutherans executed them wherever they were. And they all agreed, whatever you are, you don't want to be an Anabaptist, right? So they all insist Christians can take oaths. They all insist Christians can serve in the military. They all insist infant baptism is totally legitimate, and anyone who criticizes it is a heretic. So you can see, though, how threatening this movement was. It's always a very small movement. It was never meant to be. They actually saw this as the genuine reform of the church. They never wanted to be a little sect being hounded and persecuted. But they would say, well, it just tells you about the state of your Christianity that teaching what's in the Gospels gets you killed, which is exactly what Jesus said it would do. Right. And so if you're killed, I mean, this is their you'll know them by their fruits argument. And we'll see this in the Martyr's Mirror. They would just say, look around. Who is killing whom for faith? These people are killing us because we believe the teachings of Jesus and obey them. And so who's actually a follower of Christ? Who's actually an apostle, etc., or the apostolic church, and who's not? Just look at what they're doing. But no, in answer to your question, nobody comes out of this unscathed. There's blood on everybody's hands. And then, of course, there are also, I was asked by my colleague, Dick McBrien at Notre Dame, when I first got there, he was writing an encyclopedia of the Catholic Church. And he was divvying up the essays to various faculty in the department. And one of the ones he gave me was the English martyrs. And I did all this research on it, and I said, the English martyrs, it depends on who you are. If you're an Anglican, Ridley and Cranmer and people like that are your martyrs. If you're Roman Catholic, Thomas More and people like that are your martyrs. And if you're an Anabaptist, there's a whole new set of martyrs. And none of those groups remembers or commemorates the other martyrs. So all these people died for their faith in England, but each community remembers their own, right? They don't remember anyone else. So the Roman Catholics don't remember Ridley and Cranmer. The Anabaptists certainly don't remember them, et cetera. So it's really interesting. And Fox wrote a book on the Acts and Monuments, it's called, of the martyrs in England in particular. So the martyrology is very big during this period, but he wasn't commemorating the Anabaptists' suffering. So it's really interesting. Just gives you a window right there into what was going on in the Reformation period, that the English martyrs, there are three completely different groups of English martyrs. It's very disturbing, actually. And we'll get to that again when we start our series on the American, leading up to the American Revolution at the end of April and going into May and June. We'll look at people like Roger Williams, who had a lot to say about this, and also William Penn, about this kind of behavior. And the reaction against this state involvement with the church is absolutely foundational to the movement for civic freedom in this country. So this kind of behavior of the church in Europe is what everyone's drawn to and repulsed from in the colonies. And it's quite an argument that goes on about whether or not the churches over here should be acting like they did over there. But finally, the position of the Anabaptists was you shouldn't kill people for their faith. And that won here. It won here. Incredible odds. It won here. I mean, we owe them huge debt. And it's not very common across the world, that position. We think it is. It's not. Right? So, I'm sorry, that was the question there, Joe?
How many volumes there were in that encyclopedia of the church?
How many volumes? No, it was one. He had a word count. So if you went over, I had to get it with, I can't remember, it was like 200 words or something. So you had to, I like that. Actually, anyone can go on forever, but it takes a lot to get it boiled down. So anyway, it was a really interesting project, though. It was very sobering. My wife and I when we were in London, went to a church called St. Etheldreda, which is a Roman Catholic church. It's right in a neighborhood that used to have a Carthusian monastery in it. And we walked in and they had this huge stained glass windows of the martyrs, especially the Carthusians who were killed during the Henrician Reform. And she was blown away. She didn't know anything about the Catholic martyrs, right? And so it was very, very moving to see that. And they hated the Carthusians in particular because that monastic community was very highly respected everywhere, especially in England. So they went after them. Henry went after them in particular. Well, the Martyr's Mirror, as I mentioned, was published in 1659 by a Dutch Mennonite. And it's huge. It's absolutely a huge book. And it has these illustrations as in the one that's on our handout for this morning. It actually has a local history to it as well, because Mennonites were coming over here, as you may know, very early. And so when the French and Indian War broke out, discipline among the Mennonites was questionable. You can imagine it was for all of our communities, right? There wasn't really strong leadership. And so there was a sense that the Mennonites might actually join in the war, because after all, they would be seeking to defend themselves. And so 6 Mennonite leaders in the Lancaster area, very interesting, hoped that a German translation, because it was in Dutch, a German translation of the Martyr's Mirror would remind the Pennsylvania Mennonites of their predecessors in their endurance and non-resistance. And so they sought the help of the Ephrata Cloister, which had its own publishing. There's a building there now, that's the press, that's where the press was, to publish this. And they took it on, even though it was incredibly expensive, and they spent years working on it. There were 14 people working full-time on this volume. It was 1,500 pages long. It's the largest book printed in the colonies at the time. It wasn't the first book, but it was one of the first books published. And as you know, Philadelphia was another major printing center, as was New England. But 1,512 pages, if you can imagine. It weighed about 13 pounds in total. So we're just looking at this. The reading for today comes from the Martyr's Mirror. But here's the best part. During the Revolutionary War, copies of it were found. And, you know, when they would pack their muskets with paper, right, to pack down the gunpowder, they found copies of the Martyr's Mirror, disassembled them. They weren't fully bound yet. They disassembled them and used them to pack their muskets. So these pages of people dying for their faith, praying for their persecutors, are being stuffed into rifles to kill the enemy. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, right? So, but there are still volumes from this publication in existence. It was only published in England in English in the 1800s, I think mid to late 1800s, and it is actually available through, I think, Herald Press has a volume of it. So the author gives this preface to the second part. The first part is the history of believers' baptism through time up until the 16th century and 17th century. And the second part is the testimony of blood to the martyrs, so the Martyr's Mirror. And he's talking about the persecution by Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Reformed, Lutheran, etc. And the author says, from this it is clearly manifest how falsely they boast of being the successors of Christ and his apostles and of the primitive church, who have so abominably stained their hands with the blood of innocent people. For what indeed is more opposed to the peaceable, meek, merciful, forgiving, and revengeless character of Christ than to persecute anyone for his faith? What can we conceive of that militates more against the holy laws and commandments of Christ, which chiefly consists in love, peace, humility, meekness, lowliness, mercy, forgiveness, compassion, etc. If Christians are called as they are to requite hatred with love, notice how this teaching just comes right into the center of their view of the Christian life. If Christians are called as they are to requite hatred with love, evil with good, cursing with blessing, yea, must they, according to the doctrine of Christ, pray for them who oppress and persecute them. How then is it possible that they can remain Christians and themselves oppress and persecute others who have never laid a straw in their way? Can we believe that any trace, yea, any knowledge of the Spirit and Word of Christ remains where there is such a direct anti-Christian disposition and action? If, according to Christ, false prophets are to be known and judged from their fruits, there can be nothing by which they may more readily be distinguished than from their persecuting others. And so for them, this was just a slant. There's not a learned argument. You don't have a long theological argument about doctrine. Just look at what they're doing. Look at what we're doing. Look at what they're doing. Which one's bearing the fruit of Christ and which one's not? And it was a very powerful argument. But of course, if you agreed with them, you were likely going to be tortured and killed, either burnt or drowned. Right? It's kind of interesting they did the fire and water thing. But anyway. It's a very, very powerful vision. And just to bring us up to speed in terms of our own territory, Jacob Ammon, you may know, he's the originator of the Amish. Jacob Ammon was a Mennonite who had an argument with the other Mennonites that they were too lax, and he split from the Mennonites, excommunicated them in 1693. And that he actually wound up regretting this move. And he excommunicated himself and then hoped that they would bring him back in. And they're like, you're just really crazy. We're not bringing you back in. So they were never able to reconcile. But actually his hope was that those who called themselves Amish would reconcile with the Mennonites, but that did not happen. But what's interesting, he has a very different kind of spiritual vision. And the Martyr's Mirror becomes the second most important book in the Amish community. It always was in the Mennonite community, but it assumes a very high role in the Amish community. So any Amish person will have the Bible and the Martyr's Mirror. Those would be their two books. And imagine what it would do to you if you read the Bible and the Martyr's Mirror, and the Bible and the Martyr's Mirror, and the Bible and the Martyr's Mirror. So it would reinforce in you the sense that you're following the one who did not retaliate. You're following the one who prayed for those who were killing him, etc. And there are others through history who did exactly that. It's not some distant ideal. It's something that you can live right now. So it's very interesting. He also wanted frequent communion, and he also wanted more rigorous shunning of the sinful in their midst, so that this movement has a lot of things about it that are complicated. So it's easy to idealize it, but there's a lot of what we would possibly consider to be cruelty in it, like shunning your wife or shunning your children, shunning your father and mother, etc. So, and who gets to shun whom? I mean, so but shunning was the form of judgment, not punishment, not taking them to court, not suing them, not killing them, etc. So, but I want to accentuate what is clearly the case, and that is that for the Mennonites as a whole, and for the Amish in particular, the Martyr's Mirror and this vision of non-retaliation, praying, loving your enemies, etc., is absolutely at the center of their faith and their life. So it's really quite something. One of the most dramatic stories, and that's what we'll finally get to today, is the story of Dirk Willems in Holland. And we'll just go through it because this is from the Martyr's Mirror, including the illustration. And Kate, very nicely when she was copying it, said the copy I sent her, the image was off center. And so she said, I'm going to center this for you so it looks better. So I have to thank her for making it look even better. This is the culminating scene in this story, but we'll just go through the story because it just tells itself, right? In the year 1569, a pious, faithful brother and follower of Jesus Christ named Dirk Willems, and if the Martyr's Mirror says you were pious and faithful follower, means you were baptized as an adult and you obeyed all the commandments of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, was apprehended at Asperen in Holland, that's near Dordrecht, it's about due east of Dordrecht, and had to endure severe tyranny from the papists. So here he's being persecuted by the Roman Catholics. But as he had founded his faith not upon the drifting sand of human commandments, but upon the firm foundation stone, Christ Jesus, he, notwithstanding all evil winds of human doctrine and heavy showers of tyrannical and severe persecution, remained immovable and steadfast unto the end. Wherefore, when the chief shepherd shall appear in the clouds of heaven and gather together his elect from all the ends of the earth, he shall also through grace hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. And this is a very common theme in Anabaptist thought, is that Jesus is going to come back and he's going to look at your life and say, does your life look anything like my life or not? Right? And if it doesn't, and if it does, you're in. So, so then what was he charged with? I actually I should have put this earlier, but I put it, it's in the indented quote on the second page, but I could have put it earlier. But just to find out what he was charged with, this is the charging authority that condemned him. So it's on the second page. Whereas Dirk Willems, born at Asperen, at present a prisoner, has, without torture and iron bonds or otherwise, so he wasn't tortured into a confession, before the bailiff and us judges, so these are the judges speaking, confessed it at the age of 15, 18, or 20 years, so he couldn't remember how old he was, was rebaptized, of course he would say baptized, at Rotterdam, at the house of one Peter Willems, probably a relative, and that he further in Asperen at his house at diverse hours harbored and admitted secret conventicles and prohibited doctrines, and that he also permitted several persons to be rebaptized in his aforesaid house, all of which is contrary to our holy Christian faith and to the decrees of his royal majesty. Just let that sink in, right? So that's the issue. Is that legitimate, right? To combine the doctrines of our holy Christian faith and the decrees of our royal majesty. Our churches for years and years and years said absolutely, but so we'll see. We'll see that'll be later in April, May, and June. And ought not to be tolerated, but severely punished as an example to others. So you can see the torment they put these people through was meant to send a signal to others, just like what the Iranian government did in the protests in January. Right? They brought Gatling machine guns into the streets and just mowed people down, right? So as a sign. Okay, in behalf of His Royal Majesty as Count of Holland, the aforesaid Dirk Willems, prisoner, persisting obstinately in his opinion that he shall be executed with fire until death ensues, and declare all his property confiscated for the benefit of His Royal Majesty. So all of his property would be taken by the state. So he knows this is the sentence pronounced against him, right? And so this then brings us to the main story. But you can imagine, you're told by Jesus too, that if you're persecuted, flee. Right? Jesus doesn't say, if you're persecuted, go turn yourself in, right? He says, flee. And if they catch you, then fine, testify and die, and forgive them and love them as they're doing that. But you can run, okay? And in fact, we'll talk about this. So this is what happens. It's a really remarkable story. Concerning his apprehension, we're back to the second page, or the first page, I'm sorry, second paragraph. So we now know what the charge is and what the execution is going to be, and he knew this at the time. Concerning his apprehension, it is stated by trustworthy persons that when he fled, he was hotly pursued by a thief catcher, because there were people who were retained by the governments to do this. And as there had been some frost, said Dirk Willems ran before over the ice, getting across with considerable peril. So you can tell the ice is not completely frozen, but he made it. The thief catcher following him broke through. And when Dirk Willems, perceiving that the former was in danger of his life, quickly returned and aided him in getting out, and thus saved his life. That's the story. What made him stop and go and save the man who fell through the ice, who's coming to hunt him down so that he can be executed, right? You could actually, he didn't kill him, right? He didn't strike the thief catcher with a sword or shoot at him with a gun, right? He fell through the ice. Just like Pharaoh was drowned in the Sea of Reeds. And I can see somebody who believes in providence, and providence is very, very important in our history as well. Shows up in the Declaration of Independence, as a matter of fact. I can see somebody saying, I can see someone like Calvin saying, I'm not saying he would, but I can see someone like Calvin seeing the thief catcher fall through the ice and saying, I praise you, God, you've delivered me from my enemies, and when I was at my extremity, and it would be a beautiful thing, right? But Dirk Willems stops, he turns around and saves the life of the thief catcher. It's really incredible, and he does this without hesitating, okay? He saved his life. The thief catcher wanted to let him go. Well, of course he did, right? Anyone who would do that can't be this evil person you say he is, right? But the burgomaster very sternly called to him to consider his oath. And in the picture, you see the people standing on the shoreline and they're yelling to him, you took an oath that you would bring him into imprisonment and execution. And thus he was again seized by the thief catcher, and at said place, after severe imprisonment and great trials proceeding from the deceitful papists, put to death at a lingering fire by these bloodthirsty, ravening wolves, enduring it with great steadfastness and confirming the genuine faith of the truth with his death and blood, as an instructive example to all pious Christians of his time and onward, I would add. I mean, it really is, it's really an amazing story. And that's probably why of all the stories in the Martyr's Mirror, it's the one that keeps getting lifted up, and so I'm doing that here. There are many, many more, 4,000 total, so you can imagine, and there would be many more if we added to it since then. But it's just amazing to me to ask what led him to stop and turn around and save the man who's going to hand him over to be imprisoned and executed. It's really quite remarkable. Okay, then the final paragraph on the second page. In this connection, it is related as true from the trustworthy memoirs of those who were present at the death of this pious witness of Jesus Christ, that the place where this offering occurred, and notice the language of sacrificial offering, was outside of Aspirin on the side of Leerdam, and that a strong east wind blowing that day, the kindled fire was much driven away from the upper part of his body as he stood at the stake. So they're just basically burning his legs. In consequence of which this good man suffered a lingering death, insomuch as that in the town of Leerdam, toward which the wind was blowing. If you've ever smelled burning human flesh, it's got to be just an unbelievably horrible thing. He was heard to exclaim over 70 times, "Oh, my Lord, my God," for which cause the judge or bailiff who was present on horseback, filled with sorrow and regret at the man's sufferings, wheeled about his horse, turning his back toward the place of execution, and said to the executioner, "Dispatch the man with a quick death." In other words, cut his head off. But how and what manner the executioner then dealt with this pious witness of Jesus, I have not been able to learn, except only that his life was consumed by the fire, and that he passed through the conflict with great steadfastness, having commended his soul into the hands of God. So that's the way he died, was praying. I don't doubt at all that he was also praying for the people killing him. But in any case, more important actually than his prayer is what he did. And it was just so evident to him that he would stop, turn around, and save the man whose duty it was to hand him over to be executed. I mean, that's really amazing. And so that's formation. You know, we talk a lot about formation. That's formation. If that's your instinct, if your instinct is immediately to turn and help the person who's in trouble, who's going to die, who's seeking to kill you, and save his life or her life or their life, knowing that you're still going to be handed over. I mean, you could say it actually shows both things about how if you render good for evil, there are two things that can happen. We'll see this next week when we do Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We shouldn't be naive about this. If you do good for people who are doing evil, they could do even more evil, right? And just get really furious. And this is, you see this in the Martyr's Mirror, when those being executed answer very temperately and very mildly, they get even more enraged. Their persecutors, pardon me, they double down. They really infuriate, especially if they see themselves as Christian, right? And so they feel like they're being judged and condemned, so they double down. So one of the things that could happen is what the guy yells from the shore, "Remember your oath," right? So it means that the thief catcher would be in as much trouble as Dirk Willems would be if you let him go. But on the other hand, interpersonally, what Dirk Willems did changed the heart of the thief catcher. Like, it just changes heart, right? So when you do good for evil, it can also change the person and create a brother out of an enemy. And so the story is very tragic because personally, the thief catcher would have let him go, clearly. But then he's under an oath to the civil authorities to do his job, and he apprehends them. But with no animosity, though, from Dirk Willems. Yeah, Gay.
It all reminded me of the "Let This Mind Be in You."
Oh yeah, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, right?
Is what we are to aspire to.
Right.
It's overwhelming.
Right.
And the other thing about Smithfield Mine, it's a meat mine.
Right.
And it was where all the meat was slaughtered and everything else in the public execution. And it reminded me of taking outside.
Yeah.
You know,
When it was outside the city walls of London, too. Yeah.
martyrs have always been those who at the end were most priceless.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, but and you're, so Smithfield, for those of you who know, it's a very famous place, and actually the immigrants who were really not very well accepted, that was one of the first places they would live, was in Smithfield, and they work in the slaughterhouses there. But it was basically a slaughter area of the city of London, outside the walls, because it was very stinky, and that's also where executions took place. And they just love it. It was a very English article on the Anabaptists in England. It said, of course, no, they were tried at St. Paul's, but they were executed at Smithfield. That's what we'd never dirty St. Paul's with an execution. So yeah, this is the question. And the interesting thing is that the people who were very learned, the people who knew Hebrew and Greek and Latin and who worked at universities, or Calvin, he didn't work in a university, but he was a very learned guy, they weren't living this way, right? And the people who didn't know anything other than what they were taught, they might not have even been able to read the New Testament, but what they heard from their fellow leaders or Anabaptists just convince them immediately this is the way to go, they do things like this. I mean, Dirk Willems does not have a PhD in theology. If he had, he wouldn't have done that. I can guarantee it. So the mind of Christ is something different than what you know, right? It's just it just becomes who you are. And you can't imagine living any other way. You'd rather die than live any other way, right? And so that, I think, is what we're seeing here. And so it's kind of interesting, actually, that it takes until this movement in particular to start seeing what, especially in more modern, more contemporary Christianity, what loving your enemies would actually look like. And it actually looks like exactly what Jesus said, that if you follow me, you will be hated and persecuted because you follow me. You won't be hated and persecuted because you're jerks. You won't be hated and persecuted because you're revolutionaries. You'll be hated and persecuted because you refuse to retaliate, you refuse to take oaths, you refuse to obey the civic authority when they contradict what I'm teaching you. They'll hate you and they'll kill you. And love them when they do it. And do good to them when they do evil to you. Yeah, Paul.
I think just kind of to bring back to what we talked about a few Sundays ago about the Amish at nickel mines.
Mm-hmm.
After those children were killed, and they immediately forgiven it.
Yeah.
It's not at all surprising that people who have been steeped in this martyr's mirror and all of that, that's their reflexive.
Yeah, it was reflex. It was that. No, thank you for that. I wasn't going to bring that up because that's in the 21st century, but no, the nickel mines shooting is just a perfect example of what I'm talking about formation. That they immediately went to the family of the shooter. They prayed for the shooter, and they embraced the family of the shooter into their community. They prayed for forgiveness. I mean, it's just like right away. And they're like, and everyone, books were written about it, right? And everyone's like, this Christian, this is amazing. Where did this come from? They're like, what New Testament do you have? I mean, you might want to read it, but it's because they have forgiveness ceremonies and the Amish community in particular really goes after this, and that is the difference between Menno and Amen. Is that I looked through a lot of Menno's writings in preparation for today, and you don't find that forgiveness of enemies and praying for persecutors as strongly. It's there, but it's not front and center. But the Amish and the Martyr's Mirror make that front and center. So it's really, yeah, you're absolutely right. That in contemporary American history, that's the example that I would pick immediately. And in fairness, when John Paul II was shot, the very first thing he did was he went to the prison cell of the person who shot him and forgave them and would visit. And it wasn't just a one-off photo op. He would go back repeatedly. So this is not, I mean, we've all learned actually from this community. It's really interesting actually that there isn't, Christians don't behave like this anymore. I'll put it that way. But it was a long slog, and we'll see in America, in the colonies, this kind of dynamic plays itself out. Also, my wife's family was Congregationalist, and one of their daughters became a Quaker, and they sold her into slavery. Right? That's just what you did. So, and oftentimes they would cut off their ears, cut off their nose, execute them. So the colonies were just a replay of all this stuff coming from the continent. Yes, Julie.
You mentioned the effort at Cloister. I think it's free today. There's something going on.
Yeah, there's a free, yes, thank you. There's a free tour today. So if you want to see the printing press, it's open today with no charge. Thank you for reminding me. It's really an amazing place too. We took a tour of it right after we got here. And it's really, we talked about that earlier, that, the Cloister formed against his will. And then the lay people formed community around it too, which is very much what the monastic model was in Europe. And it was all kind of spontaneous. It's not like they sought to do that. But yeah, thank you for that. I just think it's incredible that the Martyr's Mirror is used to pack gunpowder into patriots' weapons during the Revolutionary War, which tells you a lot about the Revolutionary War. Yeah, Susan.
To tell the story, you used the word providence,
Mm-hmm.
and just turning around. I guess the light words that I'm thinking of are lightweight compared. Coincidence, serendipity, all that kind of stuff. So what in providence gives it more weight? Because is that what you meant? That it was providential that he turned around.
No, it was providential that the thief catcher fell through the ice. No, if you read the Bible, all the time, and the paradigm is Exodus, all the time it is the Lord frees me from my enemies, places me on a safe ground, brings me peace, right? And so if you read, I waited patiently before the Lord, he inclined to hear my cry. He lifted me up out of the miry clay and put me on a solid ground, right? And my enemies have been dispensed with. So the providence of God, what I meant was Dirk Willems could have kept running, confident that God had delivered him. God had intervened directly and delivered him from the thief catcher so that he could go on and live a life of a disciple. And that is solidly biblical. I mean, that's the Exodus, right? So what Dirk Willems did is comparable to Israel on the other banks of the Red Sea when they see Pharaoh and his army drowning, turning around and trying to rescue them, knowing that they would be killed by Pharaoh and his army if they succeeded. Right? That's what I meant. So providentially, and the Old Testament is really the most exhaustive example we have of the providence of God. Providentially, you could easily have said, if you were Dirk Willems, well, the providence of God has saved me, right? Through no action of my own. I made it over the ice and the thief catcher fell through. I mean, my temptation, right? Just keep running, right? And Jesus never said, if the person persecuting you falls through the ice and is drowning, you better turn around and save him. So this is a work that is not specifically commanded. He could easily have just kept running. But what's astonishing to me, so, and he would probably have known all this, but it never occurs to him to keep running. That's what I find astonishing. We'll talk next time. Bonhoeffer says that what Jesus is asking the disciples to be is extraordinary. He wants us to be unparalleled. He wants us to be utterly unlike the way we would otherwise be. And so you could even be a biblically informed Christian, Calvinist, or, Puritan, and have behaved very different and not unfaithfully. You could have just kept running and God took care of them. Right? God took care of my enemies. And the Psalms are full of this kind of language, right? Where you don't seek vengeance because God will. And Paul says that. He holds on their head, leave vengeance to God. So this could have been vengeance from God, right? Probably should have been vengeance from God, but he didn't, Willems didn't see it that way. That's what I just find, it never occurs to him to do anything but stop, turn around, and save the man who's trying to, who will ultimately be responsible for handing him over to death. So do you see what I mean, Susan? Yeah, so the providence of God would be, and this is the rhythm of the providence of God throughout Scripture, until Jesus, right? You hand my enemies over to destruction and free me and put me in a safe place. You got me out of Egypt. Pharaoh and his army were drowned in the Sea of Reeds. We went through the wilderness. We got to the land of promise, right? The land of fruit and honey. So that's the basic fundamental narrative of our scriptures. So you could say there's Pharaoh drowning in the Sea of Reeds again, and I'm running free. No, he turned around. And don't get me wrong, I am not picking on Israel. I'm not picking on the Jews. I'm just saying I just find this extraordinary. That's what I'm saying. So I think Bonhoeffer's right, that the discipleship when lived out like this is extraordinary. Yeah, no.
The power of the Spirit, I mean, that always read in the mystics, how the energy of the Spirit and the human connection, the true human connection, non-dual, I like the non-dual.
Right. No, exactly. So what he saw when he turned around and saw him fall through was another human being who was going to die. He didn't see an enemy. He didn't see somebody who was going to kill him. He saw another human being. And as I mentioned, I think last time, to my shame, I always thought it had to be the Reformed tradition because they really liked the Old Testament and Moses more than the Lutherans did. So during the Holocaust, they asked they interviewed people, why did you help the Jews when other people just turned the other way? And you could get killed for helping the Jews. And they said, well, they're fellow human beings. Of course I'm going to help them. So that's a really good point. And it goes back to what Calvin said, actually, that loving enemies and praying for those who persecute you and doing good to those who are doing evil is human. It's the way God created us to be. So in a way, it's extraordinary. But in another way, it's the way it should be self-evidently human. and in a non-dualistic way. But we set everything up in persecutor, persecuted, oppressor, oppressed, all of these binaries that we like, and good people and bad people. And that's the problem. I mean, it really is the problem. And we view people who are opposed to us as fundamentally evil, like just irredeemably evil. And we're, of course, just shining silver, right, or gold. We're just solid gold. So we'll get to that when we get to Martin Luther King Jr. And that is, we're far more complicated than we think we are. And therefore, but we have to remember that when we're judging other people, right? Because that's that dualism. We take all the evil out of ourselves and load it onto somebody else. Yes.
Pattern in the Bible of people that witness a miracle, something miraculous, and even that converts them for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then that moment ends and they go back to a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And the thief catcher, it reminds me in some ways like a Pontius Pilate. It's like, I see no fault in him. However, if you say crucify him, then yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Here he's reminded, but what about your oath? You can't serve two masters, so you pick the wrong oath and it goes right back to the terrible pattern that for a moment who's going to let him go.
Right, right.
That's a great lesson. It's like, I would love to be the martyr in this story, to be sort of a heroic figure. And chances are you're the thief catcher. And
Yeah, I know. Isn't that awful? Yeah.
Temporal thing, and hang out with your friends and think, God, I'm glad I didn't die yesterday.
Yeah.
And that to me is a greater lesson. Like, how do you not just see something miraculous, but all of it, take
Right.
it as a lesson.
Well, and he did initially, but look at, if you're an Anabaptist, what was he reminded of? What did Jesus tell us about oaths?
Yeah.
Don't swear an oath. So thank you, that was beautiful. So humanly, he responds exactly the way you would hope, right? Somebody does good to you who are doing evil, it converted him momentarily. And then he said, remember your oath. And the Anabaptists said, what were you doing taking that oath? You see, so it actually shows just how enmeshed Christians are in civil government, trumping the words of Jesus over and over and over, and not just civil government, society, the whole bit. But yeah, so we'll get these little glimpses in our own lives, right, of the way we should be living, and then all these other things start claiming us back. But I think it's even more ironic that the burgomaster yells out, remember your oath. Right, and the Anabaptists were killed because they wouldn't take oaths, right? Because that made them very unreliable. The state couldn't trust them. They were seen as subversive and revolutionary because they wouldn't take oaths. And some of them were. I mean, it's a very mixed bag. There were actually revolutionary armed Anabaptist groups during this period, but most of them, and Menno convinces them to give all that up. So it's a mixed bag. But yeah, thank you for that. It's a beautiful observation. There was a poem that my wife sent me called I Woke Up This Morning as a Buddhist. And it's just wonderful. He was at peace with everything. No, he was like this. I woke up as a Buddhist and I was non-dualistic and I was at peace and totally centered. And then I drove into work and somebody cut me off. And then my boss came in and yelled at me and I was no longer a Buddhist. But then he goes home and he has a dream that a deer comes up and licks him. And he's a Buddhist again. It's just but that's where most of us are, right? Is we have these glimpses that we really should live this way. But then when the cost of it, remember your oath, remember who you are. What will this do to your family? What will this do to your wife? My wife did a way back in the day when she was in sociology of religion up at Cornell. She came down to Lancaster and interviewed Mennonites and Amish about non-resistance and non-retaliation. And they all said to a person, the toughest thing about that is, what about your family? Would I not resist if my wife was attacked to be raped and murdered and I could do something about it? And they said, God help me, I don't know what I do. Right, so that actually and that was something that came up repeatedly when she interviewed people. So we're not the only, that's not an oath. That's a very fundamental tie. Could you really stand by and watch your wife or your children or both be killed? And this is what they did, right? So Michael Sattler's wife is watching him die that way, knowing she's next, and they drowned her, right? But she, she wasn't volunteered for that by him. She chose that for her life. But this is a real issue. The teaching of Jesus leaves us with a lot of things we have to think about, and one of them is, are all of these other obligations that we have really to be cut through? I think Jesus thinks they are. You shall hate your father, mother, sister, brother, etc., and follow me. That, by the way, when other people say that, we say there's a cult. Well, guess what? Jesus started a cult, and you were supposed to sacrifice everything for who? For him, not for God, for him. So he would say it cuts through everything. But these Amish and Mennonites my wife was talking to were like, I can't, how can I be a loving person if I let this happen to my family? I just can't see it. I mean, not that they're gonna arm themselves to the teeth, but you know what I mean? So all of us, it's beautiful. Thank you for bringing that up. All of us in a way are the thief, or the thief catcher. Because we see these glimpses, but then we're enmeshed in things that won't let us go fully that way. And also in ourselves, there are things in ourselves that won't let us go all the way. Because the cost is very high. I mean, we'll do Dietrich Bonhoeffer next week, and the book he wrote in 1937 was The Cost of Discipleship. And it was written against what he called cheap grace. And it has this memorable line at the very beginning. When Christ calls a person, he bids them come and die. And he wound up dying 8 years later at the hands of the Nazis. Not entirely as a martyr. He was a part of a plot to execute Hitler. So, there you go. But still, I mean, he's right, that if you read the New Testament, if you live the way Jesus wants us to live, you're going to die within a year or two, right? Well, they're baptized in 1525. Most of them are dead in 1527. The ones who survived that are dead a few years later. Michael Sattler's baptized in 1527. Schleitheim Confession follows that. He's dead in 1527. So if you follow the teaching, and Jesus, his ministry lasted, 2 years if he's lucky? It's not. I mean, this is the one we're professing to follow. Why are we still alive? And this creates a dilemma for the Anabaptists as well in this country. They've thrived here, right? And they're very land wealthy, because land, that's why people moved over here, was the land, there was abundant land, and land is wealth. So it's paradoxical that the group that comes out of the martyr's mirror is thriving, is protected by civic law, right? And enjoys tremendous freedom here, thank God. But then what happens to the martyr's mirror? Right? Where is the suffering and dying for the sake of Christ? So we're all kind of caught in this problem, like somewhere around the thief catcher.
We're in the season. We're going to give up chocolate or
retaliation, right? And resentment. And I think this would be the best thing to give up for Lent. Give up grudges and give up resentment, and add love and forgiveness.
And for your enemies.
And praying for your enemies, constantly praying for your enemies. And I mean personal enemies. It's very easy to say, oh, we should pray for whoever, the big ones. I think I mentioned this, friend of mine wrote a book called, How Hitler Becomes the New Moral Norm. And so, everyone says, well, I wouldn't pray for Hitler. Well, actually, right? Why not? But Hitler is not my enemy. He didn't ever hurt me. He hurt a lot of Jews, so there's no question about it, and a lot of other people. But it's the enemy, it's a personal thing as well. We'll look at that actually. We have one more week, and then we take some time off, and then later in April, we start up again with Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman has a really interesting sort of taxonomy of enemies. He has 3 different levels of enemies. And so that'll be really interesting to look at, because that's an issue too, is who are my enemies and what's my relationship to them. But yeah, so praying for our enemies, that's the formation. It makes a huge difference if you do. Huge. It's amazing. So if we want to emulate the thief catcher in that moment, right, and keep going, praying for our enemies and those who hate us and try to destroy us and betray us, is really the way to begin. And then doing good as well, and blessing. You know, blessing those who curse us. We're not blessing those, you know, Bonhoeffer talks about how Jesus never talks about you should love your parents and your family. Duh. Everybody does that. You know, Christians think everyone in the world hates each other except Christians. That is absolutely, I mean, everybody loves each other, right? That kind of love, that's just ingrained in us, right? So, but do we love those who seek to harm us? That's the question. And there are people who seek to harm us. There's no question about it. Personally, like end your career kind of thing. So anyway, it's. Thank you. Thank you. I realize we're 15 minutes late, so don't tell David. He knows. Thank you. So we'll look at Dirk Bonhoeffer next week. So thank you so much.